They say every empire has its cracks. Mine began with a phone call from my mother. I was sitting in my Manhattan office, a skyline of ambition stretching beyond the glass walls, when her trembling voice reached through the line. "Ethan, your father and I have made a decision. It's time we got married." The words hung in the air, absurd and old-fashioned. I was a 32-year-old tech millionaire who'd built his company from a college dorm room. I negotiated with investors, not parents. Yet, my mother's tone carried a quiet urgency I couldn't ignore. "It's an arranged match," she continued. "Her name is Grace Miller. She's from a respectable family, educated, kind, modest." Her voice faltered slightly. "But not the glamorous type you're used to." I leaned back in my chair, half amused, half irritated. "So, you're saying she's plain?" A long silence followed. It was answer enough. Arranged marriages belonged to another century, another culture, another world. But my father's health had been failing, and in our family, his wishes still carried the weight of law. I could argue, rebel, or pretend to be modern, but in the end, I would do what they asked. Out of duty. Out of guilt. Still, the thought of marrying someone I didn't love or even know gnawed at me. I dated models, entrepreneurs, women who turned heads when they walked into a room. Grace Miller, by every account, did not belong in that category. My assistant even pulled up her picture on social media, a candid shot at a charity event. Brown hair pulled into a loose bun, no makeup, plain dress, eyes that looked tired. "She seems sweet," my assistant offered. "Sweet isn't my type," I replied, closing the screen. That night, as I stood by the window of my penthouse apartment, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold, I told myself it didn't matter. I could go through the motions, sign the papers, and get back to my life. Love was a distraction, something for people with fewer things to lose. But something about that photograph lingered in my mind. The way her eyes, though unremarkable, seemed to hide a story I couldn't read. I poured myself a drink, convincing myself it was just curiosity. Nothing more. If I had known then what that quiet, unassuming woman would do to my certainty, my pride, my very sense of self, I might have torn up the proposal before it ever reached my desk. But fate, as I would soon learn, doesn't ask for your consent. I met Grace Miller for the first time in the sitting room of her family's suburban home, a quiet, sunlit place that smelled faintly of old books and lavender. Her parents greeted me with polite warmth, but my attention went straight to her. She was nothing like the women I usually met at charity galas or corporate dinners. No designer dress, no polished charm, no carefully practiced smile. Grace wore a pale blue sweater and jeans, her hair loosely tied back, a single curl escaping to rest against her cheek. When our eyes met, she didn't look away. There was no flattery, no nervous laughter, just calm composure. "You're not what I expected," I admitted, perhaps too bluntly. She smiled faintly. "Neither are you." That was the first time I felt something shift, a tiny crack in my certainty. The conversation that followed was polite, almost transactional. Our parents discussed family values, backgrounds, expectations. Grace spoke sparingly, answering when asked, her voice steady but distant. I found myself studying her, not for beauty, but for something else. There was a quiet dignity in her restraint, an unspoken awareness that she understood exactly how absurd this situation was, and was handling it better than I was. When her father left to take a phone call, and her mother went to bring more tea, the room fell silent. Grace turned to me, folding her hands in her lap. "You don't want this, do you?" she asked softly. Her honesty caught me off guard. "It's not that simple," I said. "It never is," she murmured, looking out the window. "But it should be." That was all. No accusation, no bitterness, just a quiet statement that left me uncomfortably aware of my own cowardice. On the drive back to the city, her voice replayed in my mind. I should have felt relief. The meeting was over, the expectation fulfilled. Instead, I felt unsettled. Grace Miller wasn't playing. She was just real. And that frightened me more than I cared to admit. That night, my mother called again, eager for my decision. "She's a good woman, Ethan. She'll ground you. Ground me. The phrase stung. I'd spent my life flying above everything: success, emotion, consequence. Now I was being asked to come down to earth, to anchor myself beside a woman who seemed untouched by all the glittering chaos I called life. "I'll think about it," I said, though I already knew the answer. My father's health, my mother's pleas, Grace's quiet strength, it all formed a net I could no longer escape. When I hung up, I stood before the city skyline once again, the same view that once filled me with triumph. But tonight it looked different, distant, fragile, temporary. Somewhere in the quiet suburbs, a woman I barely knew had already begun to change everything. The wedding preparations unfolded faster than I expected, an event planned with efficiency, not passion. My mother handled the arrangements while I buried myself in work, pretending deadlines were more urgent than vows. Every detail was curated to perfection, except for the one thing no planner could fix: my indifference. Grace and I met only twice after our engagement. The meetings were brief, polite exchanges over coffee. She never demanded to know my thoughts or tried to impress me. In fact, her quiet detachment irritated me. Most people tried to win my approval. Grace seemed entirely uninterested. Once, during one of our awkward meetings, I said, "You're not nervous at all, are you?" She looked at me over her cup. "Should I be?" "I suppose most people would be," I replied, half teasing, half testing. "I learned a long time ago," she said, setting her coffee down, "that fear changes nothing. It only makes the inevitable harder." Her words lingered long after she left. There was a story behind them, a shadow she didn't share. I wanted to ask, but I didn't. Curiosity felt too intimate for a marriage built on obligation. As the wedding day drew near, tension began to crack the surface. My father, frail but stubborn, insisted on attending the ceremony. "You'll thank me one day," he told me between shallow breaths. Grace is the kind of woman who'll stand by you when everything else falls apart. I wanted to argue, to say that I didn't need anyone to stand by me, but when I looked at him, I saw the fear of a man running out of time. So I nodded, swallowing the words that burned my throat. The night before the wedding, I stood alone on my balcony, city lights flickering like stars trapped beneath glass. I tried to imagine my life with her. Our conversations, our silences, the years that might stretch endlessly between them. It all felt unreal, like stepping into a story written for someone else. And yet, beneath the resistance, something stirred, a faint, irrational hope that maybe there was more to this than duty. That maybe, against logic, this union could surprise me. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, I was dressed in a tailored suit, the kind that made photographers chase me at events. But as I stood at the altar, watching the guests murmur and shift in their seats, my heart felt heavier than ever. The music began. Grace entered, veiled and silent, her steps measured and graceful. The crowd turned, whispers rippling through the air. I couldn't see her face clearly, but something about the way she moved, with quiet confidence and poise, drew me in. For the first time, I realized that the woman I had judged from a photograph might not be who I thought she was. And as she came closer, I felt a strange unease, like the ground beneath me was about to shift. The moment Grace lifted her veil, the world seemed to tilt. The woman standing before me was not the plain, timid girl I had imagined. The delicate features I'd once dismissed as ordinary were now illuminated by a quiet, confident beauty that seemed untouched by vanity. Her eyes, clear, steady, and filled with quiet intelligence, met mine with a calm that disarmed me completely. For a brief, unguarded second, I forgot where I was. The music faded, the murmurs of the guests disappeared. All I could hear was the echo of my own disbelief. Grace smiled faintly, as if she could read every thought crossing my mind. And maybe she could. There was something unnervingly perceptive about her gaze, as though she knew exactly how I had judged her and had chosen not to hold it against me. The ceremony went on in a blur of vows and applause, but my thoughts remained trapped in that moment of revelation. I had walked into that church expecting obligation. I walked out with confusion. At the reception, I tried to approach her, to say something, anything that didn't sound foolish. But Grace moved through the room with effortless composure, speaking kindly to guests, smiling when required, never once showing fatigue or discomfort. She carried herself not like someone seeking approval, but like someone who had long stopped needing it. Later, when we were finally alone in the limousine, I broke the silence. "You look different tonight." She glanced at me, amused. "Different from what you expected?" I exhaled, embarrassed. "You could say that." "People always do," she replied softly, turning her gaze to the window. "They expect less from quiet faces." Her words struck harder than I wanted to admit. For the first time, I felt small, diminished by my own arrogance. I wanted to apologize, to say that I had been wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Pride, my oldest companion, still held me hostage. As the car rolled through the city, I found myself watching her reflection in the glass. The streetlights flickered across her face, graceful, serene, untouchable. I had spent years conquering everything money could buy, yet sitting beside her, I felt an unfamiliar sense of inadequacy. When we arrived at the hotel suite arranged for the evening, she paused at the door. "Ethan," she said quietly, her tone neither cold nor kind, just real. "I know you didn't choose this marriage for love. Neither did I. But that doesn't mean it has to be empty." Then she turned away, leaving me in a silence that felt heavier than any accusation. That night, as I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, I realized something unsettling. Grace Miller was not the woman I had pitied. She was the woman who saw through every mask I'd ever worn. And for the first time in years, I didn't know whether to feel humbled or terrified. In the weeks that followed our wedding, silence became both our comfort and our battlefield. Grace and I lived like polite strangers, sharing space, meals, and carefully chosen words. She never demanded affection, never sought validation, never tried to fill the silence that lingered between us. And somehow, that quiet restraint made her impossible to ignore. At first, I told myself I was merely curious. I watched her from a distance, the way she spent her mornings tending to the small rooftop garden, her evenings reading by the fire with a soft lamp glow tracing her features. She was gentle, but never fragile, reserved, but never cold. There was a calmness in her presence that unsettled the storm inside me. One evening, I came home late from work, my head pounding from negotiations that had gone nowhere. I expected darkness and solitude, but instead found Grace sitting on the couch, sketchbook open on her lap. She looked up, surprised but unbothered. "I didn't know you drew," I said, loosening my tie. "It's something I used to love," she replied quietly. "Before life got busy." I looked over her shoulder. Her sketches were breathtaking, portraits of people and places rendered with emotion I couldn't name. Among them, one sketch stopped me cold. It was of me, but not the polished, public version of myself, the confident executive. This one looked weary, uncertain, almost lost. "You see too much," I said softly. She smiled faintly. "Only what you try to hide." For a long time, neither of us spoke. It was as if the walls that had divided us began to shift, revealing fragments of understanding neither had dared to explore. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the rhythm between us changed. I started joining her for morning coffee, asking about her art, listening when she spoke about things that mattered to her. And somewhere between the quiet conversations and shared silences, I realized I was no longer observing her. I was learning from her. Grace had taught me something my success never could, that strength isn't loud, and love isn't always born in sparks. Sometimes, it grows quietly, like light slipping through a closed curtain. One night, as rain tapped against the windows, I finally said the words I'd been holding back. "I judged you before I knew you. I'm sorry." She looked at me, her eyes soft but unwavering. "We all do that, Ethan. The question is whether we choose to see beyond it." In that moment, I understood what my father had meant when he said I'd thank him one day. This marriage, which had begun as an obligation, had become the mirror that reflected who I truly was and who I wanted to be. Grace didn't just enter my life. She changed its rhythm, its meaning, its depth. And as I watched her smile in the dim light, I realized the truth I'd spent my whole life avoiding. Sometimes, the things we resist the most are the very things meant to save us.